Okay, tonight we're going to talk about the book of Esther. I believe everyone here is familiar with that book. We have all studied it, from children on up. Now, it may be a few years since we were able to read and go through it, but I would say there's nothing I'm going to present that you have not heard before. But maybe it will bring back to remembrance some of it tonight. One thing I do need to tell everyone, that I have a tendency to drop my voice. So, if you can hear me, raise your hand, and I'll raise it up an octave. Okay? Okay. I'm going to take a look at the book of Esther. To start off with, we'll first see about when it was written, the book of Esther. The book was actually written, they think, 20 to 30 years after the events were recorded. So it wasn't actually written when Esther, the events were going on. Esther, the book of Esther, actually covers about a 9 to 10 year period, the book itself. It's going to start in the first chapter in verse 3, the third year of the reign of Xerxes, which would have been 482 or 483. And then by 472, the book is over. So it's in that time frame that this book covers, and that the book was written about, they think, 20, 30 years after it. The book then, if it was written 20 to 30 years after the incidents in Esther, it was written in 452 to 442, somewhere in that range. Xerxes himself ruled from 486 to 465, 21 years. He was murdered in his bed by his bodyguards. So we'll talk about him in just a little bit, but he was not a nice individual. The writer who wrote Esther is unknown. Some commentators think it may have been Mordecai. Some think elsewhere. But by looking at the book itself, and as we go through, a Jew did not write this book. As most of you already know, the word God is not found in this book anywhere. It's the only book in the Bible that God is not mentioned. Prayer is not mentioned in this book. Sacrifice is not mentioned in this book. Those three things, if it was written by a Jew, would have been mentioned. So it was written by someone who was familiar with the incidences that occurred, but was not Jewish. Some of the language the commentators state have a very Parisian vocabulary with it, the way it was presented. So they think it was just someone who was aware of the incidences and wrote the book. At the end of the book, it talks about a festival that the Jews, since the time of Esther, have annually observed all this time, the Feast of Purim. And some have said that the book was written to show how this observance came to be. It may have been, I don't know. We do know that whoever wrote the book was familiar with the palace, because Xerxes had a son named Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes' grandson writes, 60 years past, that during the reign of his grandfather, Xerxes' son, that the palace burned, and that he, Artaxerxes II, has rebuilt it. So if we look in this first chapter, there are very detailed descriptions of this palace. So somebody, whoever wrote it, had seen it at one time and knew very well what it looked like to have written the book. But again, we don't know who the writer is. In the Bible, Esther comes after Ezra and Nehemiah, then Esther. That is not the way it actually occurred. Ezra, the book of Ezra, of course, concerns the rebuilding of the temple. Cyrus, who was one of the first Persian kings, of course, he had been foretold to be the one by Isaiah 100 years earlier, that Cyrus was going to allow the Jews out of captivity to go and rebuild the temple. So Cyrus allowed Zerubbabel, who was the governor, and Joshua, the priest, to return to rebuild the temple. They took with them approximately 49,000+ people to go help rebuild the temple. The temple was completed at about 516 BC. Sometime when you read the book of Ezra, you will see in there where one of the kings, they think the king after Cyrus, his name was Shambliss, actually stopped the work for a little while on the temple. And then Darius, or Darius, however you want to pronounce it, started it back up and completed it. So the prophets Haggai and Zechariah also prophesied during this time frame of Ezra. Now Nehemiah, as you know, reading the book of Nehemiah, that it's concerned with rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem. The Persian king at this time is Artaxerxes. This is Xerxes, who we're going to talk about here in Esther's son. And so Nehemiah, of course, we know is the cupbearer, and he's sad. Artaxerxes asks him why, and he tells him, well, how can I be happy if my hometown can't defend itself, has no walls? And so they send Nehemiah along with Ezra the priest to go down and build the walls. Now, between the completion of the temple and the beginning of the building of the wall is a period of time of about 80 years. That's Esther. The book of Esther falls between these two time frames. And so Esther begins about 40 years after the temple's been completed and about 30 years before the walls are started. So that is the time frame for Esther. Now, if you get to chapter 1 in the book of Esther, we're going to kind of just go through this some. Look at it and see if there's something we can do. I know the theme that we have is perseverance, courage, true grit, and we'll get to that because there's definitely that in this. Not only with Esther, but with some other characters that also showed some true grit during this case. But in the book of Esther, King Xerxes goes by the Jewish name, or the Persian name, Ahasuerus. I can't pronounce that, so I'm going to go with the Greek name Xerxes. And if you read some of the other translations, they do too. They go with Xerxes also. So I'm going to go with Xerxes. Xerxes ruled over Persia, which ran from India to Ethiopia. It was one of the largest landmass empires at the time. In those days, in other words, the writer here starts the story. In these days, he was at the town of Shushan, which is called Susa. That was the winter capital for all the Persian kings, was Susa. This is the third year of his reign, about 482 BC. You come here and we start seeing a big feast that he's having. We read down into verse 4. It lasts 180 days, 6 months. This is a 6 months feast. He brings in all the nobles, the princesses, and all from his whole empire. His empire is made up of 127 provinces. So all the head people from those 127 provinces have come to see him. He's having this festival for them. Now they feel, like the commentators at least do, and the historians, that they all didn't come at one time and last 6 months. That they came in, stayed, moved on, and others came in, but the whole thing lasted 6 months. They've had 2 reasons why they may have had this, or really 3, this long a feast. One was that he had just got finished putting down revolts in Egypt and Babylonia, and that this was a celebration also for overthrowing some of his enemies. Also, it says in verse, I guess it's 3 and 4 anyway, he's talking about letting them see the glory of Susa. In other words, he showed off all his wealth, showed off everything he had. And another reason, which we'll get to, is he's also planning another military campaign. And so these 3 things are going on that he has decided he's going to bring in all the top people from all his provinces, and he's going to have a feast and have just a good time for the whole time. So starting with verse 6, we see the great description that is given of this feast, of the palace, of where they're having this. And it's this description that makes people think that whoever wrote it was either present or knew about it before it burned. So that's why they think it was written 20, 30 years afterwards. But he goes on to say that they had vessels of gold. Now you're talking about lots and lots of people, because his great-grandson had a small feast, and there was 15,000 people at it. So this is a 6-month feast. And everyone that got a gold goblet to drink from, all the goblets were different in shape and size. So you're talking about a vast amount of wealth that he had. In verse 8, they talk about drinking. All through Esther, this is a main course in a meal. I think as we go through that it is very alcoholic in their day. But anyway, they're sitting there having this 6-month-long feast. The last 7 days, everyone in Susa was invited. That means everyone that lived there was invited to a 7-day feast. And they had lots of drinking, lots of merriment. And at the end of that, on the 7th day, that the king is merry with wine. He's drunk, I would say. Now, in a separate place of the palace, Vesti's having a party for the women. In the Oriental mind or the Persian mind, men and women did not mix in society. They were separate. We'll also find out that a queen was never seen by the public, not even veiled. They were just not seen. They were seen by the court, but not by the public. And so Vesti's got her feast. Xerxes has his. He gets drunk, and he sends his eunuchs over to Vasti and says, "Put your crown on and come over here and let everybody see how beautiful you are." Well, she refuses. Okay, there's a number of reasons that people give that she refused. Some commentators think that the language means that he told her to come with just a crown and nothing else on, and therefore she wasn't coming. They also say, at least Herodias, He was a Greek historian that wrote about this period, that in the 3rd year of Xerxes' reign, his son was born. And that was Artaxerxes I. And if that's the case, it may be that Vashti was pregnant, or she had just delivered, and that she wasn't going to come over there and pray to a bunch of drunk men. And then another reason being is that women and men don't mix in public, and that this was against protocol. And if he would have been sober, he would have known that and never asked about it. But anyway, she didn't come. He's mad. He calls around all his wise men, and he says, oh my, what are we going to do? One thing about the Persian rulers, they always followed the law. So he called in his people that knew the law, the wise men, and said, okay, what does the law state? Well, the law actually states that if she refuses, he can have her killed. Well, that's never brought up. So they weren't going to go that far. And so the princes and nobles, what they call the first families of Susa, that's his closest people, they saw the king face to face, so these were his confidants, that they said, you got to do something. Every woman in Susa, when she hears that Vashti does not obey you, they will not obey us. We're going to have chaos. They're going to treat us with disdain, contempt, and do absolutely nothing we want them to do. So you're going to have to do something. And so they decided, well, we'll just take the crown from her and dispose her and put her somewhere else. And so that's what they did. So Vashti is not the queen at the end of chapter 1, that not a queen anymore, and she's been removed. Okay, now then when we start chapter 2, it starts out saying, after these things. So after this putting away of Vashti, actually 3 years has passed. During those 3 years, Xerxes has gone on a military campaign against the Greeks. During this time, he was soundly defeated in a naval battle called Salamis. He was also soundly defeated by the Greeks at Thermopylae. Everybody's seen the movie, King Leonidas and the Spartans defeat him at Thermopylae. All that occurred during this time. So in those 3-year periods, he was gone, got defeated, and now he's come back. So he's come back. He's now thinking about his ex-wife, Vashti, and he's kind of moaning. Well, his advisors say, well, we need to get you someone else. So he decides that he's going to, or they suggest to him that he goes around and gets all the fair maidens in all 127 provinces, bring them up to him. He'll pick out a new queen. He says that sounds like a great idea. And so that's what they do. And so we first see Mordecai, the name Mordecai. He was a Jew in chapter 2, verse 5. He was a Benjaminite. His ancestors had been carried away by Nebuchadnezzar when Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, was carried away years ago. And so that's also when Esther's ancestors were carried away. Esther's name was Hadassah, and that means myrtle. But when she goes into the palace, they change her name to Esther, which means beauty or star. And so her name changes in this book. But Mordecai was a middle-level official. He worked at the king's gate. Within the palace, they had a people's gate that people could come through, and then you came to a king's gate, and their officials that would stop people except those that actually had appointments to go in. And it was at this point is where Mordecai worked. That's where he worked. He had brought up Esther. They were actually cousins. but Esther was an orphan. And so he took her as his daughter and raised her. Well, Esther was very pretty. So during this gathering of all the beautiful damsels in the provinces, Esther is taken. They've come and taken her. Most of the commentators say the age group of these young girls, they all have to be virgins, was probably 12 to 17. Other commentators think 15 to 20. But either way, they were young girls. And that they were taken. Because they were actually taken. People did not just give their daughters, because they knew what was going to happen to their daughters. And we'll see that in just a minute. But they were not just freely given, because once these girls were taken, the family was never going to see them again. They were gone. And so they decide that they're going to, they take Esther. Now Esther was special. She was a special girl. If we read through, and we'll point these out as we go, everyone she met or met her liked her. We will see that these young girls were taken to a eunuch who was in charge of these young ladies, and his name was Haggai. And when he meets Esther, he likes her. In fact, he decides to do special things for her. He appoints 7 other servants to work with her only. Once she's into this, it's not really a harem yet, but this group of girls, he moves her to up toward the front, the most favored place. And this is all due to the personality and the type of girl that Esther was. It says that the maiden pleased him. This is Haggai, the eunuch, and she obtained kindness from him. He speedily gave her things for purification, 7 maidens to meet her needs, and gave her the best place in the house. And so this was done for Esther. Esther was told by Mordecai when she was taken, don't tell anybody that you're Jewish. Don't tell anybody that you're Jewish, so she hasn't told anybody. But Mordecai, since he worked at the king's gate, he was able to see the area where these girls were taken. And so he would go daily to see if he could get some information or something about Esther, because no males were allowed anywhere. Okay, if we look down that during this time that she's in with these girls, they are there for 12 months, 1 year. 6 months of that first year, they have oil of myrrh poured all on them. I don't know if that's daily or what, but anyway, for 6 months they have all this aromatic treatments. Then the second 6 months, they use other sweet odors and other things. So they have beauty treatments for a year. At that time then, one of the maidens are picked. This is just giving you an overview, verses 13 through 14, those 2 verses. They're going to say what happens. The girl is taken in the evening. She is presented to Xerxes. She spends the night. She gets in the morning. She then is transferred to the house of concubines. And unless Xerxes calls her by name to come back, she's there for the rest of her life. So that is why no one gave their daughter for this. They were taken, just like it says. They were taken. And so this is what Esther's in. And so Esther is her time. And so the girls, before they go into Xerxes that night, they're able to take anything they want with them. Well, Esther, showing some wisdom and knowing that Haggai, he'd been doing this for years, she let him decide what she needed to take. And so she only took what he told her. And now again comes the special of Esther. We look at verse 17. The king loved Esther above all the women, above any of the other virgins, and he made her his queen. So, first sight, falls in love. And so now Esther has now become queen. This is the 7th year of his reign. So the book started in the 3rd year. He went 3 years to war, 1 year in beauty treatments. So this is now the 7th year that Esther is now queen. This is about 478 BC. So the king has a big feast, big wedding feast, sends everything out to all the different provinces, and they have a big party. But again, she has not told anyone that she's a Jew. Again, Mordecai had given her that advice not to tell anyone, and she obeyed him. So, starting with verse 21, kind of as an aside, as a footnote in this book, that they're having a second grouping of these girls, not just the one that Esther was involved with, but another grouping. And during that grouping, Mordecai, being at the king's gate, seeing everyone coming in and coming out, he overhears of a plot to kill Xerxes by 2 eunuchs. And so he gets information to Esther the queen to tell the king. And so she does. But when she tells the king, she says, Mordecai has told it. Mordecai the Jew. She did not relate that she was Jewish. And so the 2 men were taken, investigated, and they were killed. Okay, that becomes very important here in just a little bit. Okay, now starting in chapter 3, we skip 5 more years. 5 more years. And from chapter 3 to the end of the book, is going to only take about 3 months. Okay? So, at this time, Haman, he's an Amalekite. He's also a Gagite. In other words, back in Samuel, you remember where God commanded Saul to kill King Agag and destroy everything that he had, and Saul didn't do that. He did not kill him. Well, this is a descendant from him. So here again, not doing what God told him, we now have problems brewing all these years later. And so Haman, he was promoted to prime minister directly under Xerxes. And he's feeling good about himself. He comes out through the king's gate. All the officials bow to him except for Mordecai. He refuses to bow and give reverence to him. Well, that just burns Haman up. He doesn't like that a bit. And so he now gets full of wrath. And so he starts deciding what he's going to do about this guy. And so he comes with a plan that not only is he going to kill Mordecai, he's going to destroy all the Jews in the 127 provinces. So he comes with a plan on how he's going to do that. Starting in verse 8 in chapter 3 through 10, it tells what he does. He goes to Xerxes and tells them that you have this diverse people throughout your province. They're scattered. They don't follow your laws. They do everything different. They stay closed together. And they're a problem, and really you'd do better to get rid of them. And in fact, I'll pay you 10,000 talents of silver to do it. That's approximately $15 to $18 million. Basically going to bribe Xerxes to do it. Well, Xerxes says, well, gives him his signet ring, says, if you write out the orders, and we'll do it, but you keep your money. Okay? So, they then decide to, Haman decides to cast lots to decide when's the best time to do this. And so a lot was called Pur, P-U-R. And so he cast Pur, and they decided on the 12th month and the 13th day. So the 12th month of the year was Adar. That's usually between the end of February, 1st of March. And it was on the 13th day of that month that they were going to go out and they were going to kill all the Jews in the whole country. That included Mordecai. Of course, he doesn't know that Esther's Jewish, the queen. But they go on and do that. And if you look at the last verse in that chapter, all these commands had been given out to all the provinces that they were going to kill them on the 12th month, the 13th day of that month. And what does Xerxes and Haman do? After signing the death warrant for whoever, how many Jews, they sat down and drink. The whole city's in an uproar, though. They don't know what to do. All these people, they don't know why. And so when Mordecai hears this, starting in chapter 4, he goes into sackcloth with ashes. Of course, this is a universal sign of distress or grief. And he starts, he being in sackcloth, he cannot go to his place of employment. They're not allowed at the king's gate dressed like that. And so he's out in the streets. Somehow, Esther hears this. Says, oh my guardian, the man that has adopted me, he's in sackcloth. I've got to know why. And so she gets some clothes together and gets one of her trusted eunuchs to go down and talk with Mordecai to say, put your clothes on here and get dressed. And he refuses. He then sends back a letter or a message to Esther, basically saying what's happened. He has actually made a copy of the proclamation for the Jewish destruction and sends a copy of it to Esther. So Esther's sitting here reading this, and now then she sees, oh my, that they're going to destroy the Jews. Mordecai also charges Esther that she has to go into the king and change this. She has to make a request to save her people. Okay, so Esther's now heard that, but she now then sends back another letter or message to Mordecai, and it says that there is but only one law to see the king. You have to be called to see the king. If you go in without being called and he does not extend his scepter to you, you will be killed. And she said, he hasn't called me for over 30 days. And so here she's fearful. This could be her death if she does this. If some of the commentators and historians write that the way the palace was set up, if the king was on his throne, that he could see people in outer areas. And if he saw someone that did not have an appointment, that was just there to see him, if he looked at them and turned away, they were taken and killed. If he looked at them and extended his scepter, then they were able to live and come in. So she was wanting to see whether she's going to get seen or not, whether he's going to recognize her or not. And so that's what she is afraid of. But Mordecai says, don't be afraid. It doesn't matter. You're going to die regardless. Says if you don't go, you're Jewish. Being a queen isn't going to save you. You're still going to die. If you go and he doesn't see you, you're still going to die. So the only thing is to go and trust and all. So Mordecai, though, tells her that if she doesn't go, that God is going to save his people by some other means. Mordecai is assured that God's people were going to be protected. Now he tells Esther that she's going to die, he's going to die, but the people will probably live. And so he comes in with just one of the famous sayings of all, who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? In other words, he tells her, who knows that you have gone through all this, you are now queen, all this has happened, but you are placed in this position because you're the one that can stop this. This may be the reason you're here. That is something we all need to think about. We need to take advantage of all the opportunities that come our way. We don't know if we don't take advantage of an opportunity, God may use something else, somebody else, and things will still go on. But it may be we're it. And so that's here. Esther is now affronted with something she's not used to. As we look at Esther, in the back, she was a very compliant girl. She obeyed Mordecai. She obeyed the people that were over her. She did not look or sound like anybody that was in charge of something. It doesn't sound like that she was going to take the initiative in anything that she did. She let other people decide for her. So she did not seem to be of the character to go out and see the king. She was very reserved. But now, having been told by Mordecai about this, she changes. She decides, if you go to verse 16, she tells Mordecai, okay, get all the Jews together in Susa and fast for 3 days. I am going to fast with the women here in my apartment, and we're going to fast for 3 days. And so, as we know, do Jews fast without prayer? No, they were basically going to be praying to God about this situation. And it's a good example. She asked for people to pray for her, and she prayed for herself. That is something we all need to do. In times of need, especially this, that she went for prayer. Okay, she finally says at the very end that basically, if I die, I die. And so she's made up her mind. She has now found that true grit, that courage. It's good for us to know that if you're not a courageous person, you can step up and become one at times. And so that is something that we also can learn from Esther, that we too can be courageous even if it's not our true nature. And again, Esther knew God was in charge. Mordecai had taught her that by raising her. Mordecai knew God was in charge. He knew that they were going to be saved whether Esther did it or not. But she may be there just for this reason. And so then we go into chapter 5, and here Esther goes to the king. She shows a lot of wisdom here. What does she do? She dresses up in her royal raiment. Now, when she met the king for the first time, when he fell in love with her, she was, I would assume, dressed to the hilt. She was beautiful. She caught his eye. Here, I think she knows she's going to look the best she can do, so when she comes in that outer court, he's going to see her. And that's what happened. She comes in and just stands on the outer court. He spies her and holds out the scepter. And so then she comes in, talks to the king, tells him not about Haman and his idea of killing all the Jews. She just comes in and tells the king that he wants him and Haman to come to a banquet she's having that day. The king says, sure. And so he and Haman go to the banquet. Get to the banquet, she feeds them, they drink, they have a banquet of wine. And king asks, okay, what's your request? What do you need? She said, well, no, come again tomorrow. We're going to have another banquet. And so King and Haman says, great, we'll come back tomorrow. So she's showing some patience here. What do you think they think about? Wonder what's going on. We're going to see what's going. It's now twice and all. And so Haman, he's all excited. He's just carried away. Oh, he's going to get to eat with the queen twice. Nobody does that. And so he rushes home. He passes Mordecai, and Mordecai won't bow to him. And now he's mad all over again. So his wife says, okay, what you need to do is go in tomorrow morning. First thing, tell the queen you want him killed. He says, okay, that's a good idea. We're going to build a gallows. Okay, there's not really a gallows back then. They did not hang people in Persia. They either, 90% of the time, they impaled them. And so it's basically just a tree with the branches cut off, made to a sharp point, and they just stuck people on them. And so that's what he had built in his backyard, because that's where they're going to hang Mordecai. And so he goes to this second feast, and the queen, they feed him. The king asked again, what are you going to do? Why am I here? What's your request? I'll give you anything all the way to half of the kingdom. And she says, oh, me and my people are dying. We're going to get killed. And he said, what? He says, yes, all the Jews. Now, she doesn't blame Xerxes, even though he's the one signed the order. Now, she's smart enough to know, no, this is somebody else's fault. And so Xerxes, she's never bring Xerxes into it. But she decides that all the people are going to get killed. She said, if we were just going to be sold as slaves, she said, I wouldn't say anything. But we're actually going to die, myself included. Here's relaying that she is Jewish also. Well, I'd like to see Haman's eyes. But the king goes, he jumps up, mad, and he says, who did this? And she says, that vile Haman. She was also smart enough to have him there so she could accuse him directly. And so the king, he hears that. He gets so mad, he rushes outside. Haman throws himself at the feet of Esther, begging for his life. Now, usually they're laid on couches, people did back then. And even Roman days, they lay on couches to eat. And so by throwing himself on her feet, he was actually halfway on the couch with her. Well, the king comes back. He sees that and he says, oh my goodness, you're attacking the queen right in front of me. Well, the eunuchs, hearing the noise, they have come in already. And he looks at Haman and starts fussing at him. Well, they automatically cover Haman's face up. That is a sign that someone's going to die and die soon. And so they knew that Haman was going to die. They covered him up right then. And so one of the eunuchs look out and says, I see new gallows over here. And so the king says, put him on him. And so they take Haman right then, stick him on the gallows, impale him instead of Mordecai. The rest of it you're going to have to read yourself. It's a very good story. I had forgotten some of it, but it's very good. But again, the courage that Esther shows, a complete change in her character for this time. And as you read forward, you will see that she has to go into the king a second time without being called. And again, he extends the scepter to her. But then toward the end of the book, she is being a lot more assertive. She is actually writing out commands. She is writing with authority, the Bible says, about this Feast of Purim. And so her character has changed due to the courage that she has showed in knowing that God has used her like God can use us today to do what He wills. We'll stop right there, run out of time. I would like to offer an invitation to anyone that would like to come forward and with a request or come forward with any needs that they may have of the church. And so if you'll come forward as we stand and sing.